Here's why the United States should eliminate the state and local tax deduction, otherwise known as the SALT deduction. The SALT deduction allows taxpayers to reduce their federal income tax by deducting state and local taxes they've paid on their federal tax return. While this might seem reasonable on the surface, the SALT deduction violates basic principles of fairness, fiscal responsibility, and federal neutrality towards states. Consequently, I believe the United States should eliminate it entirely. Let's start with how the SALT deduction forces individuals in low-tax states to subsidize those living in high-tax states. Consider two identical families earning $150,000 a year. One lives in Texas, which has no state income tax. The other lives in California, where they pay $8,000 in state income taxes. Under the SALT deduction, the California family can deduct that $8,000 from their federal taxable income, reducing their federal tax burden by roughly $1,760, assuming a 22% marginal tax rate. This means the Texas family pays more in federal taxes than the California family, despite having identical incomes. Effectively, the Texas family helps subsidize California's fiscal policies through higher federal tax contributions. This forces residents of low-tax states to subsidize the decisions of states that choose higher taxes and larger government. A family in Tennessee, which maintains its infrastructure and services without a state income tax, shouldn't be compelled to subsidize California's more expensive government operations through the federal tax code. The SALT deduction also violates the ethical principle that federal tax policy should remain neutral towards state and local decisions. Citizens shouldn't face different federal tax burdens simply because of what state they choose to live in. The tax code should treat all Americans equally, regardless of their state's fiscal policies. When the federal government provides tax relief based on state tax payments, it rewards individuals in states that choose high taxes and large government, while penalizing states that prioritize lower taxes and smaller government. Federal tax neutrality requires that similarly situated taxpayers face similar federal tax obligations. Two identical families with identical income should pay identical federal taxes, regardless of whether one lives in a high-tax state and the other in a low-tax state. But the SALT deduction rejects this principle entirely. The SALT deduction also reduces pressure for fiscal responsibility, as it insulates state and local governments from the full political cost of their tax and spending decisions. When residents can partially offset state tax increases through federal deductions, they pay less of the burden from their local government's fiscal policies. Without the SALT deduction, every dollar of state tax increase would be felt completely by the state's residents. This creates direct accountability, and citizens would clearly connect their state tax burden to their state government's spending decisions, and politicians would face stronger incentives to control costs and justify tax increases. Consider a state legislator debating a tax increase to fund expanded programs. With the SALT deduction, they can argue that federal tax relief will soften the blow for residents. Without it, they must convince voters that the programs justify the full cost. This direct accountability improves fiscal discipline. The deduction also reduces the competitive pressure between states. High-tax states lose some of their disadvantage in attracting residents and businesses when the federal government partially subsidizes their tax burden. This weakens the natural check that interstate competition provides on excessive growth in state and local government. It's also worth noting that the SALT deduction predominantly benefits high-income households in expensive high-tax states. Lower-income families rarely itemize deductions, so they receive no benefit. Middle-class families in low-tax states receive little to no benefit since their state and local taxes are already low. The primary beneficiaries are affluent families and individuals in states like California, New York, and New Jersey. This creates a regressive redistribution, where working-class families in states with responsible fiscal policies subsidize upper-middle-class and wealthy families in high-tax states. A machinist in Alabama helps reduce the federal tax burden of a lawyer in Manhattan. Even within high-tax states, the deduction primarily helps those wealthy enough to itemize deductions and pay substantial state taxes. Eliminating the SALT deduction would restore neutrality and accountability to the states. Identical families with identical incomes should face identical federal tax obligations, regardless of their state's tax policy. State and local governments should face the full political consequences of their fiscal decisions, encouraging more responsible governance. Some worry that eliminating the deduction would harm high-tax states economically, but this misunderstands the problem. If these states provide value through their higher taxes, better schools, infrastructure, or services, then residents should be willing to pay for them in full. But if they don't provide sufficient value to justify their full costs, then they shouldn't be funded. The federal tax code shouldn't shield state governments from the consequences of their decisions, or force responsible states to subsidize irresponsible ones. True federalism requires that state decisions carry state consequences. Eliminating the SALT deduction would create a more equitable system where federal tax burdens reflect federal benefits, not state policy choices. It would restore competitive pressure between states and encourage fiscal responsibility at all levels of government. Most importantly, it would ensure that Americans with equal incomes contribute equally to the federal government, regardless of what state they live in. If you enjoyed this video, please check the description for ways that you can support me and consider sharing this video with a friend.